Thank you, Sarah. So is the sound working?
The sound is indeed working, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic, great. Kate, I really love the second last slide you showed with the risk matrix, and I'm going to hit you up for that when we finish these.
It'll be good to chat and share with you. Thank you.
Yeah, just great. And I think, I don't know if this is planned or not, but with what Kate said, now I'm going to jack right out to the very macro view of the same issues. The two talks are completely polar ends of the scale, but they do inform each other. It's a bit of an odd statement there, Schrodinger's world of resources, what we want and need can't all happen at the same time. Partly why some of that can't all happen at the same time, and for some of the reasons that Kate was talking about, but there are other very large macro drivers involved as well. But as geoscientists, explorers, mining companies, we really need to do better if we're going at all levels, right, at the community level, right through to the macro level, and actually finding stuff and bringing it into production. There's a book I referenced there called Upstream, which I like recommending a few books when I give a talk. It's a way of thinking, and I can illustrate what it's like just by giving the anecdote right at the start of the book. It's not related to the cartoon, that's something else. But the book starts out by saying that there are a couple of people standing next to a river and a kid comes past the river drowning. And so the person jumps in, pulls the kid out, and then goes back onto the shore. Then another kid comes past drowning, and the other person jumps in and grabs the kid and pulls him out. And then another kid comes past, and the person who's got pulled the first kid out jumps in and grabs that kid, but the other person just leaves, runs off, and he shouts out from the river, "Where the hell are you going?" And he said, "I'm going upstream to find out who in the hell's throwing all these kids in the river." Right. Now, as an industry, we're pretty good at coping with stuff when it goes wrong. We're not particularly great thinkers at thinking in an upstream way and fixing things before things go wrong to ensure that they don't go wrong. And that's one of the things, this little theme I'll touch on later on about how we can do things better and ensure that the world has the stuff that it needs. If you're also interested in some of these concepts, and I'm just going to touch on some of them, I could bore all of you for hours somewhere in the world at some point. But there's another good YouTube podcast thing called The Great Simplification by Nate Hagans. He talks about this a lot, and one of his great quotes is, I don't believe there are any non-radical pathways forward. And I'm going to illustrate some reasons why he says that. Now, to go back to some of the things Kate was talking about, I think one of the issues is in the world is we forgot how we got here, right? We have no concept of what we've used already from a resource point of view to provide the lifestyle and that we're used to and think that we're entitled to. So that's just a graph there from 1970 to 2020 of consumption of stuff, be it biomass, non-metallic minerals, fossil fuels, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute, and metals. So from 1970 to 2023, it's gone from 30 billion tonnes to 105 billion tonnes of stuff. People have said, yeah, but that's just population increase. It's not. Right? Population's gone up 2.5 times in that time, but our consumption of stuff has gone up 3.5 times, so it's exceeding population growth. Any way you look at resource consumption in the world, everything is up and to the right. And this is what I mean a bit about Schrodinger's. To be able to satisfy that demand and keep us in the lifestyle we've all become accustomed to and lift people out of poverty, that's the only way that can go. But we are going to have an immense amount of trouble finding the stuff we need to push things up and to the right. Just to pick on fossil fuels, one of the reasons, and I know we're talking about critical minerals here, but we can't forget about the fossil fuels. They got us to where we are. Our consumption of fossil fuels has just been absolutely enormous. And although we're making great strides in bringing in renewable power supplies, it's still, well, to put it in Australian, a 15th, if you like, of the total energy consumption that we're reliant on. And if you think about energy consumption, it is also up and to the right and has been, well, since 1800, you can see there. But the rate of acceleration of energy consumption will go up. The rate of acceleration of energy consumption will go up. Well, that's what people will want. Whether we can supply it or not is a completely different thing. People say, well, you know, maybe there's some limits. Maybe this will top out at some point. But really, when you look at the global population, The important word on that slide is no. So the percentage of the global population with no access to electricity, clean water, the internet or sanitation is still extremely high. And so to get people out of, to increase the quality of living for all of these people who have access to, do not have access to these very basic facilities, will also require an enormous amount of resources to be extracted and made available and energy to be generated. You'll get the Schrodinger's flavour here. Not all of this can be true at the same time. Or polarities is another good word. Just odd things that go at the world. So I'm going to touch on geopolitics as well, but just hanging with hydrocarbons at the moment. Who would have thought, and this is a little slide here about predicting the future and trying to work out what's going to be happening even in 5 years. Who would have thought that the US would be the greatest producer of crude oil, far exceeding Saudi Arabia over a time space of about 5 years? Furthermore, who would have thought that the US would be the greatest exporter of LNG, liquefied natural gas, in a short period of about 5 years? About 8 or 9 years ago, the US retrofitted their LNG import terminals to be export terminals with the onset of the shale gas and shale oil revolution. In your part of the world over there in Europe, sort of sobering to think if the US hadn't done that, it wouldn't have been able to supply the LNG to allow Europe to disconnect from Vladimir Putin's supplies. So someone's already brought up unintended consequences. This is sort of a positive unintended consequence. A talk like this is never complete without the requisite climate panic graphs, which I make no apologies for putting in. I'm calling this Schrodinger's or polarities. Everything is up and to the right. We want to increase consumption of everything, but there are other things going on in the world. We're leaving our footprint on everything. So if you want to freak yourself out, you can look at temperature and temperatures, global temperatures. You can look at the mean sea surface temperatures. I dare say a lot of you have already seen this graph, which is particularly striking. People argue about that pattern you see in 2024. There's about 3 theories. One of them, we're all stuffed. Actually, it's all going to hell in a handbasket. Second theory is it's at the 95th percentile predictions. I don't know if that statement is any different to the first one. And the last one is that because we've taken sulfur out of ships' fuel, we're not making clouds and very bright white clouds, which reflect energy back into space. And so that has actually had the effect of letting more energy through and warming up surface temperatures. Who knows? But the fact is it's happening right now. But this is real. So it's impacting things now and things are measurable. This graph is really subtle, but really, really important. It's talking about sea level rise. And the really important thing here is it's talking about a change of rate of sea level rise. Now, people look at this and go, yeah, Dave, whatever, 4 millimeters here. What the hell does that mean? Well, here's an article out of The Economist, and The Economist is not typically given to hyperbole when they talk about things. And here's a very real effect of what's going on here, talking about the Antarctic. The US right now is looking at planning a project worth $57 billion to build out infrastructure to protect the Houston and Galveston regions, so the petrochemical plants, ironically, in that part of the Gulf in the US, to protect them from ingress of seawater. And why? Why are they looking at spending this money to increase the height of the seawall? They say much of the sea level rise is now going to come from Antarctica. So they're factoring that in to their programs. Now, infrastructure is also a resources thing. I know we're talking about critical minerals and things here, but also fossil fuels, but also infrastructure. We need lots and lots of cement and sand. Sand is actually, for building purposes, quite difficult to get your hands on. It's not a joke now to say that there are people actually selling sand to the Arabs, which used to be quite a good joke, but it's not anymore because people are doing it. There are other things. How are we going to move power? Right, these are other things that impact our industry. So if we want to electrify everything, we need to move the power around. The existing grid infrastructure, the high tension power lines, are all ancient. The technology was developed when it was developed in the early 1900s. It changed once in the 1970s. Not much has happened since, but there are new technologies around which will allow the existing power infrastructure to conduct 2 to 4 times more power. That will need aluminium, right? And by the way, the manufacture of cement for infrastructure produces 9% of the world's carbon. So there's another Schrodinger effect, if you like, that somehow we're going to need to work out. And then people just lately talk about the building, AI data centers, the power consumption of those things is also accretive onto demand of critical minerals, copper especially, and how fast a data center is being built. I heard this quote just this morning that Meta, Microsoft, and Google have spent $32 billion on data centers in the first 3 months of this year. The first 3 months, right? So things to try and get your hand around. The war in Ukraine, balkanization of supply chains. If you split those who voted to censure Russia or abstained against those who didn't, you can split the world in two. If you can look at these as potential trading blocks of the future, and then if you split the resources across those two trading blocks, that's quite a worrisome thing. So not only is exploration hard and mining hard enough, we may now actually need to find some things twice, or find twice as much of it if the trading blocks become too violently in disagreement with each other. Now, just to copper, I always like this graph. So I know we've been talking about some other critical minerals. You know, they are thin markets, really. Copper is not a thin market. It's been exploited as fast as we can exploit it for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The requirement for copper doubles every 25 years, has done since 1900, as a compound annual growth rate of about 3.3%. That's what that's equivalent to. You can look at the graph there, where in the current time, it's about 26 million tonnes, including recycled stuff. Go ahead to 2050, puts it at 50 or 60 million tonnes. Where on earth is that actually coming from? And that is without decarbonisation, without electrification, without AI. That is just the pure increasing industrial use of copper to give us all of the infrastructure that we like. So again, it's an infrastructure spend. So it's a bit of a, this is why I like this duck, call it the existential duck, crisis duck. You just pick it up every now and squeeze it and the light comes on, and it somehow makes you feel better. I've got no idea how that works, but it's not going to help you find any more copper. So what can we do to do things better? So just finish off on a comment here before I hand over to James. We find it difficult to adopt technology to help us in the search for new materials of any sort, or to ameliorate the impact of extracting them and using them. And that's partly because as an industry, we have a very hard time valuing information and new technology in dollars. Most of us here, a lot of us here at Geoscience, not all of us, but many of us, we think things are cool, but we can't mount a financial argument for it. Now, these guys here on the right here are all Canadians. Andrew Gillies is doing a PhD under John Steen. He looked at impairments for 105 TSX listed mining companies over a 15-year period. And in that period, just for those companies, they announced $60 billion worth of impairments, and fully a third of those impairments were due to geotechnical and geological factors that weren't taken into account. So the point of this is that it's hard enough to find something. It's even harder to bring it into production. We don't need to make our life harder and delay bringing things into production effectively by not collecting relevant information and using technology appropriately right at the start. So this has been something that's annoyed me for a long time. We are running now a big $1 million project between the MDRU and BRIM at UBC, IDEON, and ourselves, looking at coming up with financial metrics to actually attach a dollar value to the collection of information, either front loading it in exploration or the use of technology and measurement systems during production. And it's to address some weird questions, like who pays to prevent something bad from happening? So how do you convince someone to pay for something to ensure it does not happen down the track if it's a rare event but it has a very large asymmetric downside financial impact? These are very hard conversations to have in our industry, but most of us here would have life insurance, so we implicitly understand why we pay for life insurance. The other problem we have as an industry is we want someone to pay for something here to an exploration program. The beneficiary may be a metallurgist 10 years from now at the back of a mining operation. So they're separated in different pockets and also different time periods. So the reason for running this project is to try to formalize a financial way of working these things out. And we are on the hunt for postdoc students to work in the project. If you know someone, they could please contact Sean Barker at the MDO over at UBC. And I'm just finishing here with one more book recommendation. The AI cartoon there on the right there, actually found 10 years ago, it popped back up in my Facebook feed, and I thought, God, how amazing and relevant it is 10 years later. But the book on the left there, The World for Sale, I would recommend that for anyone that works in the resources industry. It actually explains to you how stuff is traded and moved around the planet and sold. Ultimately, call it disturbing. But if you read it, you'll understand why the sanctions against Russia aren't working particularly well over the Ukraine war. Neither have sanctions worked particularly well elsewhere as well. There's always a seller and a buyer for everything, no matter what is said in the world. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to James. And James, to save some time, I can advance the slides for you if you want.
Yeah, okay, we can do that. Yeah, so this is taking what Dave said. We're now going to dive into a little bit. How do we start doing something about some of these problems? So next slide, Dave. But what I want to do is just start with a personal journey shared. So I'm a geologist. I'm also a landscape and nature photographer. And what that allows me to do is look at the landscape. And, I think, here's a photo from Abisko in Sweden in the Arctic. And when I stand and look at a landscape like that, I feel both a love and a fear for the industry that I've worked in so much. And how do I now help that industry to take a landscape like that, do what we need to do as a society, and utilize the resources we need to get ourselves out of this pickle, but do it in a way where that landscape is retained. And I think this is where technology really comes to bear. And my driver here is that I do believe there are solutions. And if I look at a landscape like that, and I think about the fact that there may be, a resource of copper sitting underneath that landscape, do we need to dig an open pit? Are there other ways we can get that resource out? And I think there are, and I think as a society, we can do this. And I'm going to make a little statement here for Andrew Scott, if he ever watches this video, that he came up with the concept of the autonomous inchworm that runs around under the ground, eating rock and spitting out gold. And I think that's the kind of big sky thinking we need to solve some of these problems. Next slide, Dave. And I think this is all captured really nice. I did this yesterday. This is using DALL-E 3, one of the AI art systems built into Microsoft's Copilot. I just asked it to paint a picture of a copper mine in the Arctic. And I think that just summarizes where we sit today with our industry versus society, in the fact that is scraping the internet for everything it knows about how it would paint a picture of a copper mine in the Arctic. Okay, it's false, but it has all the aspects of what society believes through the internet of what a copper mine would look like, and I don't want to see that. That is not what we should do. So how do we solve that problem with technology? So next. All of this comes back to, ultimately, as geologists, I'm going to bring this back to a very practical level. At some point, we drill a hole. And we drill a hole in the ground because we want to take a sample. We want to measure stuff in that sample. And we want to take that data from the measurements to make an interpretation, because ultimately we need to make a decision. This is the decision chicken. And we need to make that decision to move around that cycle. And the bottom line is that our industry has struggled because the productivity of that cycle has been not as good as it could be. We don't move around that cycle quick enough, and we don't generate enough information. And so how does technology come to bear to help us with that? Next slide.
Sorry, James.
And, I think Dave's touched on this. The other challenge we have here is that our industry has worked in isolation of different parts of its project life cycle. So if we look at a project coming from discovery all the way through to production to actually close out, all of those bits of the business work in complete isolation. And so how do we move ourselves so that the information we generate in that very first drill hole we put into the ground has value, adds value throughout that life cycle of that project? We need to kind of deal with data infrastructure there. We need to be collecting the data correctly up front. Next slide. And so this is I'll let people play the video back to look at the details, but this is one of these value of information slides that Dave talked about as well. And this is talking about the NPV, the total value of the project. and really illustrating how you could take a project and you can maybe invest 100 million extra dollars into that project, but by doing so, you release 227 million extra dollars of value in that project. And as an industry, we need to be collecting this information better, because we need to make better and smarter decisions faster, because that's how we're going to get to where we need to with preserving that landscape picture. But that does require an upfront cost, and it does require us to communicate the value of what we're talking about better than we have done as well. And that's something on us to do that. Next slide. And as an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, here's just a workflow. So this is a new technology. This is a driller deployed gamma tool going down a drill hole, collecting information about the rocks. But the technology deployed by the driller, so it's faster, more efficient, but the data itself doesn't mean anything until you run some analytics on it. You turn it into a, geologists don't like wiggly lines, it turns out. They like colored boxes, right? But and you take the colored boxes, and that tells you about what you're seeing in your core. What does that do? It allows you to have that information in your hands when you first look at that rock. It allows you to log faster. It allows you to make smarter decisions. It allows you to modify the way we drill. Caroline touched on that earlier. So here's a way where we can start to bring that kind of digital and hardware world together to speed up and increase the productivity. Next slide, Dave. And here's a similar example. Again, don't worry about the details, but it's really talking about how do we take best quality data. This is best quality potable XRF data, so pressed pucks, run some kind of analytics for those that love it. This is UMAP with the k-means clustering done in Iogas, and use that data to tell us something about the rocks. It could be vectors to ore, it could be lithology, it could be ore type, it could be what have I got problem rocks, what's my product quality. So, you know, as an exploration geologist, I'm not going to look for copper. I'm going to look for the right copper with the right ancillary elements that I can process with the most sustainable way. So that's where we can bring that technology together and do it up front in our projects. Next slide, Dave. And I hope as you're looking at this, what I want to illustrate really is that what I've shown you there can be done today. Not next year, not in 5 years' time, today. But what it requires is technology implementation into our projects to really leverage that productivity gain, and that requires change management. And I think one of our big challenges, I guess, in the industry is captured in this cartoon. You know, are we actually going to change, or as the markets rebound in 12 months' time, are we going to go back to our old ways? And I think that's something where we need to look at as a community. How do we manage that change through? So next slide, I think it's the last slide, Dave. Hopefully I'm alleviating Sarah's schedule anxiety slightly. So what I talk about a bit is the iGeologist, right? It's the future geologist that is embedded into a digital infrastructure, digital technology infrastructure, and they're going to use analytics, AI, if you like, as a tool to support them to be smarter. And we need to communicate the value of this information that we're generating in a new business model that will drive the change. If we don't communicate to the people holding the purse strings in an economically sound framework, we won't get the change we want. And technology is going to be at the heart. Technology is the heart of the next generation anyway. It's going to be at the heart of the next geoscientists, and they will not accept poor behaviors. So we need to get to grips with this. And I'm just going to leave this last phrase, and I can expand on it later. You know, my thing at the moment is I think that exploration geologists need to be seen more as product managers of our critical resources. They need to manage the discovery of quality product, and they need to have an understanding of that whole end-to-end piece, including the supply chain. So I think I'm just presenting a picture there of how I see the future, but the future isn't a year's time. The future's now, that we can have this iGeologist working in an industry that drives the change we need to address the things Dave's talked about with the technology. So I think I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you very, very much, James and Dave. The chat has gone bananas. There's only, I mean, I think that is the correct adjective for it. And by chat, I mean not just the chat here, but everything that's going on behind the scenes, because I know there are lots of WhatsApp groups of people discussing what we're hearing now.